On average, African Americans carry about 80% African heritage, though it varies widely. Some have nearly 100% African ancestry, while others may have up to 28% from other parts of the world. The largest part of this African ancestry traces back to the Yoruba people of West Africa, mainly from what's now Nigeria, but it doesn't stop there. The genetic landscape also includes influences from Bantu-speaking communities, the Manda people, and various Central African Americans often look distinct from other Africans. And where exactly do their roots trace back to? Here's something you might not know. Most African Americans didn't come directly from Africa to the U.S. Many were first taken to the Caribbean, enduring another leg of the journey before being brought to the southern.
Now listen to me carefully. What if I told you there are truths about the bond between Africa and Black America that have been deliberately hidden from you? What if the story you were told about our separation was incomplete, and that the real story holds secrets that could change how you see your own name, your own blood, your own future? Towards the end of this story, I will share something so powerful, so deeply buried in history, that when you hear it, you will not look at your life or your people the same way again. In fact, I dare you to guess in the comments what you think this revelation will be. And when you reach the end, see if you were right. Before I take you on this journey, I must be honest with you. Stories like this do not get pushed by the YouTube algorithm unless you make them move. If you are hearing my voice right now, it means this story has already defied silence to reach you. But for it to reach another son or daughter of Africa across the ocean, I need you to share this video, leave a comment, and hit the like button. This is not just for numbers. This is for our voice, our connection, our truth. The platforms that control what you see might not want this story to rise, but you and I together can make it rise. Let's do this for those who came before us and for those yet to be born. Let us begin. The history you were taught in school likely began with slavery ships, chains, and a brutal voyage across the Atlantic. But what if I told you that the Africa-America bond began centuries before those ships set sail? Ancient African sailors and traders reached the Americas long before Columbus claimed he had discovered it. Evidence has been found in South America, ancient African carvings, symbols, and even traces of plants that only grew in West Africa at that time. These are not myths. They are documented by explorers, scientists, and even in the oral histories of Native American tribes who speak of black-skinned visitors arriving on great boats from across the sea. Now, remember what I told you earlier. By the time we reach the end, you will understand why such connections were erased from history books. But for now, picture the early centuries, Mali's great empire, with leaders like Mansa Musa, whose wealth was so legendary it could collapse economies. Musa's predecessor, Abu Bakr II, is said to have sailed west with 2,000 ships in search of new lands across the ocean, never to return. Where did he go? Many believe he and his fleet reached the shores of the Americas centuries before the transatlantic slave trade even began. Some will argue that this is speculation, but the evidence whispers loudly. In Mexico, among the Olmec civilization, archaeologists have uncovered giant stone heads with distinctly African features, broad noses, full lips, and proportions that match the physiognomy of West Africans. These sculptures are thousands of years old. Historians often explain this away as coincidence, but if you've ever seen the details, you'll know this is more than chance. These were not random shapes, they were faces. And here's where I want you to stay engaged, because this early contact changes the narrative. If Africans had already reached the Americas long before slavery, it means our connection to that land and its people is not one of chains and suffering alone. It is one of exploration, exchange, and brotherhood. Yet that part of the story is never told in schools. Why? Because it changes everything about how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. Hold that thought in your heart, because later in this story, I will reveal how this hidden bond became a threat to colonial powers, and why they needed us to believe we had no history together before slavery. But before we get there, we need to travel through the centuries, through the pain, the resilience, and the quiet codes that kept Africa and Black America spiritually connected, even when oceans lay between us. Now, to understand this Africa-America bond, we must go back centuries before slave ships crossed the Atlantic, before America was even an idea in the minds of European settlers. There was a time when African sailors, traders, and explorers touched the shores of the Americas. Evidence exists in ancient maps, artifacts, and oral histories that suggest African contact with the Americas long before Columbus. It is a piece of history deliberately hidden or dismissed because it does not fit the conventional narrative. But if we are willing to see with open eyes, the pieces of the puzzle come together. You see, the African presence in early America was not just about enslavement. It was also about knowledge transfer. The agriculture that fed the southern states' rice, okra, black-eyed peas, watermelon, these crops came from Africa, and with them came the expertise of African farmers, who knew exactly how to cultivate them. Without this transfer of skill, many American plantations would have failed. Yet, history books often portray Africans only as labor, never as the agricultural scientists they truly were. And then there is music, the rhythms that would become jazz, blues, gospel, and later rock and roll, all have roots in the drum beats of West Africa. Those drum beats carried not just sound, but memory-coded messages, spiritual connections, and a sense of identity that could not be erased, no matter how harsh the conditions. That is why even in the darkest times of slavery, music was a weapon of survival. Pause for a moment and think about that. The very heartbeat of American music is African. Every time you hear a blues guitar cry or a jazz saxophone sing, you are hearing Africa speaking through America. And yet, how often is that truth acknowledged? Now, friends, remember what I told you earlier at the end of this story. I will reveal something that will change the way you see this Africa-America relationship forever. Something that ties not just the past and the present, but also shapes the future. So stay with me. If you are feeling what I am saying, please take a second to comment below. Tell me, have you ever heard these things before? And if this is opening your eyes, do not keep it to yourself, share it. Because the YouTube algorithm does not work in our favor when we tell truths that shake the walls of conventional history. And this story, my friends, is one of those truths. Now, as we move forward, let's explore the powerful role Black America played in Africa's fight for independence. In the 1950s and 1960s, when African nations began to break free from colonial rule, it was not just African leaders who stood up. It was also voices from across the ocean in America. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Maya Angelou, and many others traveled to Africa, building bridges with leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. They exchanged not just words but strategies, visions, and dreams. This was not charity, it was kinship. It was the recognition that the struggle of a black man in Alabama was tied to the struggle of a black farmer in Ghana, that the chains of oppression, though shaped differently in America and Africa, were forged by the same hands. And yet, there were forces both in America and in Europe that feared this unity. They knew that if Africans and African Americans stood together politically, economically, and culturally, they would form one of the most powerful alliances the world had ever seen. And so, they worked to weaken it through propaganda, through division, through economic manipulation. But still, the bond endured. Before I move on, let me remind you what I will share towards the end is something even most historians never openly discuss. It is not just about history, it is about the present and the coming decades. And when you hear it, you will realize why this Africa-America bond must never be broken again. So stay with me. Keep liking, keep sharing, and keep talking in the comments. After the official abolition of slavery in the Americas, the physical chains were removed, but a new set of chains, mental, economic, and cultural, remained. And yet, something extraordinary happened. Across plantations, small towns, and growing cities, the African spirit refused to die. It changed form, camouflaging itself inside the daily lives of a people who were told to forget their origins. In the churches of the American South, there were hymns, but listen closely, and you would hear African rhythms hidden beneath the gospel melodies. These were not accidental. They were the coded drum beats of West Africa, transposed into hand claps, foot stomps, and call and response patterns that could pass under the watchful eyes of those who policed culture. The ring shout, an old form of worship where participants moved in a counterclockwise circle while singing and clapping, seemed to the outsider like simple spiritual expression. But for those who knew its true roots, it was Africa breathing in exile. The circular movement mirrored traditional West African dances meant to summon strength, blessing, and unity. The griot tradition, the West African oral historian, survived in unexpected ways. In the American South, these keepers of memory became preachers, blues singers, and folk storytellers. Every sermon, every song, every tale passed down on a front porch was a fragment of Africa, preserved against the erosion of time. In the early 20th century, a new wave of awakening began. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican-born leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, electrified black communities with the vision of Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad. Garvey was not just a political activist, he was a restorer of memory. He reminded the African diaspora that they were not the children of slaves, but the descendants of kings, queens, builders, and navigators. This message crossed oceans. Garvey's movement sent ships, the Black Star Line, across the Atlantic, symbolizing the reconnection of a severed family. Though the project faced immense resistance, both economically and politically, the idea had already taken root. The African and the African American were not strangers, but kin. Even in the arts, the connection endured. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s brought a burst of creativity that drew openly from African motifs, sculptures, textiles, and rhythms-inspired painters, musicians, and poets. Langston Hughes traveled to Senegal and Nigeria. Countee Cullen wove African imagery into verse. They were rethreading a torn cloth, and yet, with every step toward reconnection, there was pushback. Colonial powers feared that a cultural awakening among the African diaspora would inspire political unity, and they were right. The mid-20th century was a time of upheaval. In the United States, the civil rights movement was demanding the dismantling of segregation. Across the Atlantic, African nations, from Ghana to Nigeria to Kenya, were rising against colonial rule. These were not isolated events. They were two fronts in the same global struggle. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. Just months later, African-American leaders began arriving in Accra. Martin Luther King Jr. attended Ghana's independence celebrations, standing beside Nkrumah as fireworks lit the night sky. In that moment, the symbolism was unmistakable. The liberation of one was the liberation of all. Malcolm X, in his later years, took the struggle to the world stage. In 1964, he traveled to Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, and Tanzania, meeting with African leaders and addressing the Organization of African Unity in Cairo. He urged them to see the plight of African Americans not just as a domestic issue, but as a violation of human rights that demanded global solidarity. But this unity was a threat to established power. Intelligence agencies, both American and European, closely monitored these meetings. The fear was simple. If Africa and Black America aligned, politically and economically, They could form a power bloc with unmatched cultural influence and resource wealth. Evidence of interference is well documented. Leaders like Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, who sought partnerships with Black Americans, were assassinated under circumstances that still bear the fingerprints of foreign powers. In the U.S., organizations that encouraged African American solidarity with Africa were infiltrated and destabilized. The strategy was not just to kill leaders, but to fracture trust, to make African Americans view Africa as distant, chaotic, and irrelevant, and to make Africans see the diaspora as disconnected and westernized. This was psychological warfare on a global scale. And now, the truth promised at the beginning, this is not just a matter of history, it is a matter of present-day strategy. In think tanks, policy rooms, and confidential economic forums in the West, there is an unspoken acknowledgement. A united Africa and Black America is the single greatest geopolitical threat to Western dominance in the 21st century. Here's why. Africa holds 30% of the world's known mineral resources: cobalt for batteries, rare earth elements for electronics, gold, diamonds, and vast reserves of oil and gas. It also holds the largest arable land area on Earth and the youngest population, a workforce that will outnumber China's within decades. Black America, on the other hand, represents a consumer market worth over $1.6 trillion annually, global leadership in music, film, and sports, and a deep reservoir of intellectual and technological talent. Culturally, African American influence shapes global trends, from fashion to language to art, often faster than entire governments can respond. Put these two forces together, not as strangers but as coordinated partners, and the result would be an unstoppable engine of cultural, political, and economic power. It would mean African resources could be developed by African and African-descended entrepreneurs, not foreign conglomerates. It would mean technology transfer, mutual investment, and shared cultural platforms that bypass existing global gatekeepers. And this is exactly why, for centuries, the narrative has been controlled. The erasure of pre-slavery contact, the division of post-slavery movements, the propaganda portraying Africa as a land of poverty and chaos. All of it has served one goal: to keep the children of Africa from realizing that together, they are already one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. This brings us to the present moment, and to you, the listener. The question is no longer whether there is a bond between Africa and Black America. The question is whether we will rebuild it intentionally and irreversibly. We live in a time where connection is easier than ever. In seconds, we can speak to each other across oceans. We can trade goods, exchange knowledge, and share stories without asking permission from the old gatekeepers. And yet, many of us remain strangers to each other, still trapped in the narratives written by those who profited from our division. The work ahead is not just about remembering history. It is about forging a future in which the son of a Ghanaian farmer and the daughter of a Detroit engineer see themselves as part of the same family, the same mission, the same destiny. It means African universities partnering with historically Black colleges to create joint programs in engineering, medicine, and the arts. It means Black American investors funding African startups and African innovators bringing solutions to African American communities. It means a shared cultural renaissance, music, film, literature, that does not wait for approval from Hollywood or European publishers. But above all, it means telling the truth to our children. You are not the descendant of slaves alone. You are the heir to explorers, builders, scientists, kings, queens, and visionaries. You are part of a global family whose roots run deep into the same soil. So, here is my final call to you. Share this story. Discuss it with your family, your friends, your community. Let it spark ideas, projects, and alliances. Do not let another generation grow up thinking their history began in chains. We were cut apart, yes, but our roots still drink from the same soil. The time has come for the world to hear our heartbeat together.